we're going to jump right into How to Fight Racism by Jemar Tisby. It's a courageous Christianity and journey toward racial justice.
And this is his more recent book. That we talked on the last show with Neil a year ago about The Color of Compromise. Mm-hmm. This one has come out now more recently. So I thought that's probably a good one. We did a book club
we just did a book club through it.
Our friend Melissa Palou led a group of people through that book. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it'd be good to highlight that because Tisby is an important voice in the conversation.
Super important voice in the Christian space.
Yeah.
And because he just partnered, well, it's not just anymore, but he recently partnered with Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah.
So let's kick off the questions with what is the big idea of this book?
So I think the book is basically a how-to manual. I mean, the title is How to Fight Racism, and the chapters, not 2 through 10, are all how to explain race in the image of God, how to explore your racial identity, how to study the history of race. So they're all how-to chapters. And so I would say the big idea is that we can pursue racial justice by following what he calls the ARC model, ARC, which means awareness, relationships, and commitment. So the whole book is how to pursue racial justice by seeking awareness, relationships, and commitment. And then those three parts, they have 3 chapters each that show you how to do various elements of building awareness, relationship, and commitment. That's a big idea.
So would you say that this is kind of Tisby expanding on the last few chapters of The Color of Compromise? Now he's kind of unfolding his model for racial justice and unity. That's really what this book is about.
Yeah, I think it's chapter 11 of Color of Compromise is the sort of practical chapter on what you can do. This is essentially a whole book length expansion of that chapter, and he gives a lot more details. But it is really like he took that one chapter and made it much longer and more detailed and turned it into an entire book.
Okay. Now, for those who may not be aware of who Jemar Tisby is, can you give us a bit of background of who he is, his credentials, expertise? Like, why does he speak into this space?
Sure. So he is a bachelor's from Notre Dame. He has an MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary and a PhD. He just received his PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. So he's a professional historian. And as you said, he just started working for Ibram X. Kendi as the assistant director of advocacy and narrative for Ibram X. Kendi.
Mm-hmm. I know Kendi hasn't come out with any kind of faith statement, not that I've seen anyway, or, testimony, but what is Tisby's, like, either faith journey or is he a Christian? Is he progressive?
So he's a Christian. He was a member of the PCA. He went to Reformed Theological Seminary, is a Presbyterian seminary, but I don't know whether he'd consider himself an evangelical anymore. He definitely was in the past, and I don't know if he belongs to the PCA any longer. I just don't know. I looked it up. I couldn't find any information on his church affiliation or his even his theology really. Today, but he's definitely a pressing Christian.
And I think that's really a gracious way of saying it is, I think a while back he was kind of a key voice in the Reformed kind of racial reconciliation. Mm-hmm. There was a Facebook group prior to his current organization. He's over an organization called the Witness Collective, I think is his umbrella organization, and his podcast is trying to think of I can't remember the name of his podcast.
Okay, so it's actually interesting. It's kind of maybe a little bit hints at his trajectory. So he founded an organization that was originally called RAAN, the Reformed African American Network. And then a few years ago, it changed its name to The Witness, a Black Christian collective. So they dropped the Reformed from their title. That might have just been, for sounding more relevant. I don't know why. But they definitely, now their vice president is decidedly not Reformed, and probably, I don't know, like I said, Tisby was once, professing evangelical Christian. I don't know if either of their current, their vice president or current president would would say that they're evangelicals. I suspect they would not. Their vice president is a pastor, Allie Henney. I believe she's a pastor in the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what did you find helpful about Tisby's book, How to Fight Racism?
Yeah, there are elements that are true. Like, for example, he talks about how race is a social construct and that we need to understand human identity through the imago Dei, right? We're all made in God's image. From one man, God created all men. He actually, in the book, he explains the gospel in ways that would resonate with evangelicals. He talks about how sin separates us from a holy God, and Jesus came to rescue us from sin. So, and it's like a one paragraph summary of the gospel, but it's definitely an evangelical summary. He talks about how the end point of all this discussion is harmony, where unity in the midst of diversity prevails. It's page 7 of the book. So again, he's aiming towards harmony and unity with diversity. When he talks about how to understand, how to separate good history from bad history, he urges you to read primary sources. That's excellent. And he says, when you do that, how do you decide which sources are reliable and if they're secondary? Obviously, primary sources are primary sources for a reason. You're reading diaries, you're reading letters, but when you're looking at secondary sources, how can you tell which ones are accurate? And he gives interesting advice. He says, beware of a history that includes clear heroes and villains. That's actually very perceptive, right? If you craft a story where there's one clearly good side, is purely good, and one side's purely evil, that's likely to be because reality is more complicated than that, right? There, as we know as Christians, there are no really good people. We're all sinners. And so any history that spins one side as the heroic champions of justice is probably, or freedom, or what is probably covering up some skeletons in the closet. And I personally, I would say, actually, the other thing you can do, which he doesn't mention, is read both sides. If you want to know whether a historian is treating his subject matter accurately, well, read a conservative historian, read a liberal historian, read a libertarian, read a foreign historian, read a history of, say, the American Revolution written by, say, a person from France or from Africa. So a completely different perspective on that subject. So anyway, so that's very good. He gives advice for making friends. He says one of the big ways to bridge divides in the church is via relationships. That's actually excellent, because one of the criticisms of evangelicals that you'll hear from anti-racist educators and other scholars is that evangelicals think they can solve racism via friendship and by relationship, because we're kind of relational in the church. And he says that's actually not wrong. We can help fight racism via friendship. So go make a friend who's a different race than you. So that's great. I'm like, yeah, who would sponsor a school? He says, and who's going to say, no, we should not be sponsoring a school. We should not be caring for impoverished neighborhoods. More practically, he talks about criminal justice reform. He cites cash bail, for example, as a source of real injustice. And I haven't looked into that policy-wise, but it seems he makes a good case that, cash bail sort of unfairly advantages rich people. If you're rich, you get arrested for a crime, you post bail. If you're poor, you can't. So you're stuck in jail. And he gives an example of a young man named Khalif Browder, who was accused of stealing a backpack. And they arrested him on the understanding, we'll release you soon. He spent 1,000 days in jail, 2 years in solitary confinement, only to have the prosecutor eventually just drop the case. And he was released, but it was shattered mentally, and he ended up committing suicide. So just tragic story. And I'm like, that's something that we can all get behind and say, look, there are real injustices here that disproportionately affect people of color. And so that he considers that a important racial justice issue. And I think we can all say, hey, let's absolutely work to make our laws fair and just. Two more. One is that he says in the book that he's not seeking to pit the personal against the systemic. So racism in his description can be both interpersonal animus and bias and bigotry, or it can be systemic in nature. But he says we don't have to choose. We can both attack personal bigotry and also systemic issues. And then finally, he just says that when you get really into the anti-racist movement, you can end up feeling superior to everyone else, these benighted people who are not woke like you. He says, don't give in to that. He says, actually, his phrase is cancel contempt. Do not feel contempt or superiority towards other people just because you happen to be woke and they're not. And those are all positives of the book. And I think it's worth noting that there are positives in the book, because I think overall, I would not recommend the book. But I think even in books you wouldn't recommend, you can still say, but there are elements of truth that we can say that this I can agree with.
Well, I'm glad that there were, that you graciously pulled things out that were helpful, and I could agree with the things that you pulled out and saying, this could be helpful. But you also said that overall you wouldn't recommend the book. So what are some of the concerns or criticisms that you would offer?
Well, so my big concern is that his approach to race and justice is grounded in critical race theory. Now, he anticipates that objection. He says, well, that's ahistoric because blacks have been talking about racial oppression for centuries. And I would say, well, yes, but the language he's using, just his whole framework, if you want to attribute it to critical race theory or the Black liberation movement or something, it doesn't matter where it comes from. I'd say it's the wrong framework. Now, you'll see as I go through the examples of this, you'll see why I say that. But in general, I would just say that framework is just the wrong. It's false. It's not true. It does not correspond to reality. But also, for Christians, it conflicts with a lot of our ideas about racism and how we ought to view it. Things like partiality, justice. So that's sort of the background. Now, I'm not going to make it clear. I'm not simply saying he subscribes to these ideas that correlate to critical race theory, therefore the book's garbage. I'm not saying that. I'm going to give specific criticisms, but my overall concern is to read this book and embrace it is to enter into a framework that is ultimately, I think, very harmful for the church. But that said, I'm going to give you specifics. I'm not going to just ad hominem and be like, well, he's doing critical race theory. It's garbage.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Neil, because I think that a common misconception that I hear a lot of well-meaning Christians say is, well, critical race theory was brought about by Marxists and it's a godless framework, so therefore we should disregard it. Well, that's actually not necessarily the best reason to disregard it. Rather, we look at the tenets of it and then we ask the question, does this correspond to the Christian worldview? Does this correspond to the Bible? Is this true or is this false? Does it correspond to reality? That's why we think of critical race theory as a framework as being potentially untrue, unbiblical, potentially even dangerous. So I think that's a really good clarification.
Yeah. So I'll go through the big, I have several issues here. One of the big ones is either a lack of clarity or very broad definitions that he uses for terms that are very important. So, for example, the entire book's all about the journey towards racial justice. He does not one single time define the phrase racial justice in the book. He just does not give a definition at all. And I consulted with several other people who had the same frustration. They're like, well, you're talking about racial justice all the time, saying how it's so important that we're invested in racial justice, and yet he never defines what he means by it. So that's pretty significant that he's using a very obviously justice is something Christians ought to pursue, but to use that term without explaining what he means by it is concerning. It'd be like, imagine writing a book about how Christians ought to strive for sexual justice or gender justice or reproductive justice and never defining that. Well, you're using a morally loaded term that's going to draw people in and yet never explaining what's entailed by that term. So that's in and of itself, that's already, you're like, that's not a good precedent. Now, in an interview later, a few months ago with Phil Vischer, the VeggieTales creator, he actually did define in that interview, he defined racial justice as giving Black people their due, which he's drawing on traditional understandings of justice as giving everyone their due. And he's saying racial justice is giving Black people their due. And he goes on to say that, well, Black people have not received their due in this country. So it's time for them to receive their due in this country. So, okay, that's a little bit of a definition. But right off the bat, a lot of terms you're going to see in what follows that they're either ambiguous or the way they're defined is, I think, concerning. So the second example I have is how he uses the terms equity versus equality. I'm just going to quote him at length here on the difference between equity and equality. So he says on page 4, throughout this book, I often use the term equity rather than equality. Equality aims to promote fairness. This is only effective if all participants have similar starting points and the same access to resources for achieving their desired goals. Equity, on the other hand, demands that individual needs are taken into consideration. It accounts for identities, race, ethnicity, ability, nationality, gender, etc., and circumstances that may otherwise hinder the success of one participant over another. So you see he's explicitly contrasting equality with equity. This is a very common contrast that's, brought in by critical race theorists and anti-racist educators, because they would say treating everyone equally, fairly, is not really appropriate when the people involved are not equally situated socially. So, an obvious example would be if I say, okay, I build a set of steps going up to my school, right? And it's equitable. And someone says, well, my child is in a wheelchair, that she can't use a stairs. And I say, hey, equality. This guy can use the stairs. Your daughter can use the stairs. Everyone's equal. And well, in that case, you'd say, no, we should make special accommodations because she is in a wheelchair. We should build a ramp for her because the equal set of stairs, although there's formal equality, there's not equity because you're actually denying her access to the school because she can't get in. So we all recognize that some degree of equity, meaning taking into account people's access, is appropriate. The problem, though, is, well, when is it appropriate? He doesn't really ever address that. So, and you'll see again as we go on, you'll see how this all snowballs. Okay, so does that make sense? How he's using equity and equality in a way that's we're going to see ends up being kind of problematic.
I think one of the biggest problems that I see right now is like how that contrasts with scripture. So when we look at justice biblically, it's not just about giving somebody their due. It's about unequal weights and measures, about treating people impartially. And when we look at equity and this idea of, like, to use your example, access, well, I think the fact that there's a disability creates a different scenario or situation. But what we're not doing, which a lot of, in what I've read anyway, a lot of equity experts or people who advocate for equity want to do is take from the people who may have. So I can take the stairs, but now we're going to take something from the person who takes the stairs so that we can build a ramp for the person who may need a ramp. It's a form of theft a lot of times.
Yeah, in the case of, say, a handicap ramp, most people would say, okay, I don't mind if my taxes go to build a handicap ramp, right? I mean, that's kind of like, okay, there's some cases where sort of an equity mindset is legitimate.
Yeah.
If someone truly is, say, physically handicapped, then yeah, build the ramp so they can have access to the school. When it gets more tricky, there are other cases, though, where you're like, wait, this doesn't really seem like you said, it violates the principle of impartiality. Mm-hmm. So now here's an example. I'll give you next. The next thing he says on page 5 and 6, he says, to enact society-wide change, people must commit to deconstructing laws that have a disparate impact on people of different races and rewrite the rules so they lead to greater equity among people of all races and ethnicities. Now, what you see, this is really important. He's saying that we have to take into account disparate impact, and if laws are disparate impacting different racial groups, they should be rewritten. Again, you're like, well, when though? Because sometimes laws that are just will have disparate impact. For a really simple example, it's going to sound silly, but laws against something like arson, right? Laws against arson are good and just. You shouldn't burn down buildings, but obviously not every racial group commits arson at equal rates. I don't even happen to know who commits it more. I just don't know. But the bare fact that we have this law leads to more, say, Hispanics getting arrested for arson than Asians. We can't though go from, then we should dismantle the law. It's creating a lack of equity. No, you can't go from inequality of outcome, therefore we must rewrite the rules. But he never specifies which rules, what's the criterion for determining whether a rule is just or unjust. It's got to be more than just disparate impact, but he never goes beyond that. And his new employer, Abraham X. Kendi, explicitly says that every single law is racist if it leads to disparate impact and lack of equity. And every law that leads to more equity is anti-racist. He is, I mean, I can give you quotes from Kendi. He's emphatic on that. And many people have pointed out that's insane. There are lots of laws that are good and just that lead to disparate outcomes. And you can't just dismantle all of those. I mean, private property laws, right? There's wealth disparity. How do you fix that disparity? Get rid of private property. Is that just? Well, no, that's really dangerous, in fact.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about Kendi as you were talking. You know, you mentioned Dr. Pat Sawyer, who I call Uncle Dr. Pat, earlier in a conversation with him about Kendi. One time, I remember him telling me, you know, every inequity or every inequality is not an automatic injustice. And I think we have to be thinking about that when we look at inequities or inequalities. You know, do we see biblically that inequity is automatically an injustice?
Right. So you see here again how these definitions are snowballing. He's not refining racial justice at all. When he defines equity and equality, he's immediately going to disparate impact and inequality of outcome, which is obviously not a good proxy or a good, you know, for injustice. We can't know that. Another example is he defines racism as a system of oppression based on race that is a problem nationwide and worldwide. Everyone is either fighting racism or supporting it, whether actively or passively. This is, again, something very similar to what Kendi says in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist.
I was going to say that
Kendi
really
has that exact, almost
echoes Kendi's ideas quite closely.
like almost to the T in wording.
The funny thing is that prior, you know, when I reviewed Tisby's first book, I pointed out the similarities to sort of critical race theory's ideas and terminology. And I got a lot of people saying that's so unfair. How dare you? He's not going to support critical race theory, even though he says he finds it helpful in a podcast. And then here, when I wrote the review, I think he hadn't gone to work for Kendi yet. But of course, I noticed the similarities in the language. And sure enough, a few months later, he announces he's going to work for Kendi. So I'm just pointing out that I'm not just saying Kendi equals bad. I mean, Kendi's ideas are bad, but I'm not assuming. I'm just pointing out Kendi is a radical. He says crazy stuff, and I've reviewed his books. I can point them out to you. But the fact that Tisby is now working for him should show you that, again, there's a trajectory these ideas have. Here's another example. So because Tisby defines racism as a system of oppression, he says things like this: reverse racism is an erroneous concept, because people of color may act in prejudicial ways against white people by judging them solely based on their skin color, but racism is more than an individual or interpersonal attitude. So he's using that racism is prejudice plus power, which, again, you've heard a billion times from critical race theorists. So they'll say—
and Eric Mason.
Yeah, and lots of people have adopted it as Christians. But the argument is that people of color can be prejudiced against whites, but they cannot be racist because people of color don't have the institutional power. Ironically, Kendi rejects that argument in his book and says, no, that argument is actually racist because you're denying people of color the idea that they don't have power, but they do have power.
Even a small bit is what he says.
Yes. So my only point, though, is that as Christians, so forget about again, Kendi's right on that, by the way, but my point is, as Christians, what should we think about racism? And if you view racism as a form, a subspecies of the sin of partiality, well, sin does not depend on the power we have in order for us to commit it, because sin is ultimately against our Creator. We sin primarily against a holy God. So if racism is a sin, then anyone can commit it regardless of their social location. So this whole idea that, you know, blacks can't be racist, Asians can't be racist against whites because they don't. No, anyone can be racist because anyone can sin against a holy God. And what I would also say is that playing these semantic games is dangerous. You would not want to redefine the word adultery to apply only to men. You wouldn't, so right, because, or I know if you commit infidelity as a woman, you're just cheating. But men have power, so they're committing adultery. Well, no, that gives you a false idea about who we are, human beings being made in God's image and therefore sinning against a holy God. So again, that you're seeing now how this entire framework is really rooted in ideas that I would say are not compatible with a proper Christian view of race. Sorry, go ahead and I'll go faster. I'm kind of going slowly here.
That's okay. You're laying a lot of good groundwork there.
So, okay, let's just skip to some, I'll just quote some stuff. And then I think you guys would maybe your eyes gonna go wide because I posted these quotes on Twitter and people are just shocked at them. And I think rightly so. And you'll see why in a second. Let me just start with one. So the question, of course, is how pervasive is this racism? Because Tisby repeatedly says it's all over the place. It's pervasive. It's endemic to our culture. So, for example, he says, white supremacy, of which racism is a component, constructs concentric circles with white people of European descent in the center, the place of privilege and importance, more financial wealth, and the presumption of innocence and normality. By the way, it's all lifted directly from the CRT literature. I can give you quotes. Then he says, outside of this central category are all other people of color, no matter how much Black people attempt to assimilate by adjusting their patterns of speech, style of dress, and social networks. Listen, Blackness in a white supremacist society can always be weaponized at any moment as a tool of dehumanization, no matter their level of achievement. People of African descent in the US, especially those with darker skin, are always situated in the outermost ring of American social circles. This is what a white-centered society looks like. Let me repeat that sentence again. No matter their level of achievement, people of African descent in the US are always situated in the outermost ring of American social circles. Now, coincidentally, a couple of weeks ago, President Barack Obama had his 60th birthday. It was a 500 guest party at his $12 million 30-acre house on Martha's Vineyard. The guests included Jay-Z, Stevie Wonder, Tom Hanks, Oprah Winfrey, Charles Barkley, and Grant Hill. Is that what it looks like to be on the outermost ring of American social circle? I mean, that statement is just so far removed from reality. Now, again, we're talking about Obama here. It's not like just any random guy, but it's just not true that all Blacks are always situated in the outermost ring of American social circles. What do you tell me, Monique? Am I wrong? Right?
I was trying to figure out, I don't know what I must be. If that's the outer ring, I'm far in a galaxy far away. Like, that's where I am. But I mean, you also look at Tisby and Kendi, who are surely not, trying to piece nickels together to make a meal. Like, they are, if they're on the outer, can I get on that outer rung? Like,
and they're being feted. I mean, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, gave Kendi $2 million, I think, for his anti-racist center. I mean, they're going on CNN interviews. They're, so I'm thinking, I can only imagine their social lives are pretty busy. So again, let me quote, so I don't go on there. I'm just pointing out that statement is just not empirically true.
Yeah.
But let me quote someone for you that I think will be interesting. So, and here's a sort of a counterpoint to Tisby's claim here. Here's the quote. The continuing assumption of universal marginalization across every era of African-American history actually flattens the African-American experience and contributes to the increasing irrelevance of Black preaching. What do I mean? The experience of African Americans in 1830 could be fairly characterized as near universal enslavement, oppression, and marginalization. Few would deny that. But how should we describe African Americans in 1930? Moreover, the 1930s seem like a lifetime ago for African Americans born around 1980. The experience of 1980s generation African Americans, like Tisby, by the way, roughly, is so different from previous generations that a burgeoning number of books dare to argue for a post-Black self-understanding. Listen to the last sentence here. Any monolithic understanding of Black experience crumbled long ago under the shifting weight of African-American progress and hard-earned victories. Now, that long passage, there's more to it than that, comes from Thabiti Anyabwile in his book, Reviving the Black Church. So he's a prominent Black evangelical Reformed pastor, and he's saying, no, it's not true that all Blacks are universally oppressed and sort of pushed to the margins of their social circles. Maybe in the 1830s that was true, maybe even the 1930s, but not today.
Yeah.
So again, that's just again, the framework, this idea that all Blacks are suffering under the oppression of white supremacy. That's just not empirically true.
So we got to keep going, Neil.
Like, I know, okay, I'll give you a few more quotes here. I'll just quote these things.
Okay.
You are truly my cousin.
He says,
this isn't Black church.
He says we have to learn theology from the disinherited. So he talks about how any reformation in the way people think about race and ethnicity from a Christian perspective must include learning from people who have experienced marginalization and oppression. Those include voices of those sometimes called liberation theologians. And he mentioned explicitly James Cone, who we'll talk about hopefully later tonight. But he says we need to learn about race from James Cone, people like James Cone. He says this: white people must constantly cultivate humility in order to acknowledge their complicity in racism and engage in the process of repentance and repair. Racism is designed to be invisible to white people, just the way things are, or this is the right way to do things. So when they are confronted by the reality of racism, it can offend their sense of personal innocence. There is no way around this feeling. You have to go through a process of deconstructing the ways white supremacy has skewed your perception in order to see the reality of race more clearly. And then he says, finally, it is time for many of us to go home to the Black church or other ethnic specific fellowships. The sad truth is that as long as there is racism in the white church, there will always be a need for churches comprised primarily of racial and ethnic minorities. It is not about segregating ourselves. It is about gaining the strength to persevere as a person of color in a society enthralled by white supremacy. And his former organization, The Witness, that he founded, had a whole hashtag movement series called Leave Loud, where people shared their stories of leaving their white churches or multi-ethnic churches even for the Black church. And they were encouraging others to consider doing the same. So, people long ago said, this movement is going to ultimately divide the church. And here we have Jemar Tisby saying it's time to consider leaving your predominantly white church for the Black church. So it's happening.
Sorry, I was just looking at a comment that came in on Facebook. Before I'm gonna say the comment before we go to the next book and get your thoughts on it. It's from Philip Hannum, and it's two parts. He says, I do not think you are hearing the argument. Tens of millions of Christians and Donald Trump argued that Barack Obama was literally not one of us. That was not legitimate to belong. And then the argument is not that Black citizens can't function at the center, but that whiteness, and I think it's at any time, when push comes to shove, will take Blackness and shove it right to the margin and try to take back our country.
Right. So that, first of all, that's not what he says, though. This is the thing. I know you can make an argument like something like that. Now, I don't think that's necessarily even true anyway. I mean, I don't deny there are people who believe that real Americans should be white or, whatever. There are people that believe that. But he's saying something else. I'm going to quote it for you. No, and he mentions Barack Obama in the previous sentence. So he's got them in mind when he says this. Because he says they faced racist insults, and they did. And he's saying that's an example of how no matter how high you climb, you'll always face racism. Now, and I believe that, right? You can face racism no matter if you're the, king of England or you can be really high up and still face all kinds of harassment. But he says something else. No matter their level of achievement, people of African descent are always situated in the outermost ring of American social circles. Is that statement true? Mm-hmm. You say, well, no, he's just exaggerating. Okay, fine, but he's exaggerating. But the point is, the entire book is suffused with this idea that Blacks are universally and homogeneously marginalized, and that whiteness is centered. But again, we can have a long conversation about whether that's, well, it's not, I think, accurate. That's very contextual. There are undoubtedly circles, there are undoubtedly places in the U.S. where you will be marginalized for being Black or being Hispanic or being Asian. But there are other places where you will not be. For example, actually, Thabiti Anyabwile in his book gives the example of New York City during the Harlem Renaissance, when there was this thriving entirely Black community. It was artistic. And he's like, people in that community were not really day-to-day experiencing oppression or marginalization because they were living in this enclave of tremendous success. So again, and his point, Thabiti's point, was that you can't universalize, and that was 1930. Think about what it looks like in 2021. So I'm just cautioning that kind of hyperbole, if you don't want to call it hyperbole, it's inaccurate. And similarly, he makes these generalizations about how white people are all blinded by their privilege. We just saw that quote I quoted there. And these are, I think, dangerous generalizations to make because they're applied to, essentially shape the way you think about race and shape the way you ultimately behave. I think that's not correct.